Some places in the American wilderness are simply empty, miles of trees and rock where nothing exists but the wind. But other places feel different. They feel like they are waiting. In October 1985, a family of 5 drove into the mountains of West Virginia for a simple weekend camping trip. They were prepared, they were experienced, and they were cautious. They parked their car at the trailhead, walked into the woods, and completely vanished. For 33 years, their disappearance became a local legend, a ghost story about what happens when you step off the path. But the truth wasn't that they were lost. The truth was that the mountain was hiding them. This is the story of the Henderson family and the ridge that refused to give them back. Welcome to Signal 49. The story. It began on October 12th, 1985. It was one of those clear, honey-gold Appalachian mornings when the mist still clung low between the trees, and everything felt slow, familiar, and safe, and in the gravel driveway of a small home in Clay County, West Virginia. 35-year-old Mark Henderson stood tightening the straps on a roof rack. Mark was the sort of man who double-checked everything: tire pressure, water bottles, trail maps. He was meticulous, a trait that made what was about to happen seem even more impossible. His wife, Dana, leaned in the doorway, helping their youngest zip a jacket while the 2 older kids chased each other across the yard. It was supposed to be a weekend away, just one night under the stars before the autumn turned cold and school schedules took over again. They were headed for Laurel Ridge Trail a few hours east, a route locals called gentle enough for kids, but wild enough to feel alive. Neighbors later remembered exactly how ordinary it looked. The family Bronco backing out of the drive, Mark waving once before the curve hid them from sight. It was a departure devoid of drama. There was no sign of strain in the marriage, no crushing debt, no hint of plans to disappear. Dana had even left a note for her sister, promising to call on Sunday evening. She never did. By Sunday night, the first calls went unanswered. The silence that settled over that house in Clay County was the first sign that the ordinary world had broken. By the next morning, a co-worker from Mark S. Mill phoned the Clay County Sheriff's office to report that the Henderson family hadn't returned. At first, deputies assumed the usual minor tragedies of travel: a flat tire, a wrong turn, or a breakdown. These mountains could play tricks on city drivers, and the roads winding up toward Laurel Ridge were unforgiving. But by the afternoon, the tone of the situation shifted entirely. A ranger found their Bronco parked neatly at the Laurel Ridge trailhead. It was not wrecked, abandoned in haste, or hidden. It was simply parked. The keys were still in the ignition. A picnic cooler sat untouched in the back seat, with sandwiches wrapped in wax paper and a thermos half filled with lemonade. Everything inside the vehicle looked like a pause, not an ending. A light rain had come through overnight, washing away the soft soil around the vehicle. There were no boot prints, no tire tracks, not even the faint trail of a child's shoe. The ranger called the scene "too clean," a phrase that would echo through every report filed for the next 3 decades. The passenger door was unlocked, but there was no sign of a struggle, no broken glass, no forced entry, no blood. Mark's maps were still folded on the dashboard, one corner marked with a red pen circle around a scenic overlook 2 miles up the ridge. That red circle became the focal point of the investigation. That is where the search began. Helicopters hovered low that afternoon, their rotors pushing the autumn leaves into spirals as they scanned the canopy. Volunteers and park rangers spread out in a grid with flashlights and whistles, calling the children's names into the trees. But the woods answered with absolute silence. The geography of the search area turned hostile almost immediately. The following day, storm clouds rolled over the ridge, drenching everything in cold rain and turning the dirt paths to slick red clay. It made tracking impossible. By Wednesday, search dogs were brought in from neighboring counties, but the handlers were left frustrated. The scent trail didn't wander off into the woods. It simply died less than a mile from the parking lot. It was as if the family had stepped into a bank of fog and simply kept walking until the world swallowed them whole. Reporters arrived by the weekend, drawn by the irresistible and terrifying narrative of 5 people vanishing on a well-used hiking loop. Locals gathered at the volunteer fire station, bringing casseroles and coffee to the search crews, desperate to help. Everyone wanted to believe it was just a matter of time. Mark was known for his caution. Dana had wilderness training from her college years. People told each other that the family would show up hungry, cold, but fine. But as daylight thinned and the weather turned, that confidence faded into a heavy, collective unease. Investigators began to examine the few clues they had, and the more they looked, the less sense it made. Inside the Bronco, everything was neat. Too neat. The driver's seat was pushed back exactly as Mark left it. The radio was dialed to a country station that no longer broadcast a signal this far up the mountain. The odometer showed only 12 additional miles from home, consistent with the drive there. Deputies noted that even in heavy rain, footprints or tire impressions should have lingered somewhere near the trail entrance, yet there were none. A sheriff later described the scene as frozen in time, like someone had wiped away their exit. The first theory was a wrong-way trail split leading to a creek bed. The second was a bear encounter, but rangers found no signs of disturbance in the surrounding brush. No torn fabric, no drag marks, no snapped branches. By Thursday, the tone shifted from rescue to recovery. The mountain felt different now, quieter, heavier. Helicopters circled but caught nothing beneath the dense canopy. The last recorded search log from that week reads simply, "Visibility poor. Scent lost near Overlook. Family not located." Back in Clay County, neighbors left porch lights on through the night, a symbolic vigil for a return that wasn't coming. The small church on Main Street held services where people prayed for the children's safety. Dana's sister, Lydia, refused to sleep, pacing between the sheriff's office and her car, demanding to go into the woods herself. Deputies held her back, promising that professionals would find them soon, but they didn't. By the end of the second week, the Hendersons' faces were everywhere, stapled to telephone poles, pinned to gas station corkboards. Grainy photographs of smiling children and their parents, sunlit and happy, contrasted sharply with the caption below them. Missing since October 12, 1985. The search stretched into November, then scaled back as hunting season opened and snow threatened the upper trails. Each new effort ended the same way: empty ground, unanswered questions. People in town started whispering. Some said they might have staged it, run off to start fresh somewhere to escape a debt no one knew about. Others believed something darker lurked in those woods. Old mine shafts, hermits, remnants of bootleg routes no longer marked on maps. Still, no evidence ever surfaced to support any of it. The Bronco sat impounded in a county lot, growing a thin film of dust, while the investigation slowed to a crawl. By Christmas, the sheriff stood before reporters and called it one of the strangest vanishings the region had ever seen. He paused before adding, almost reluctantly, "We may never know what happened up there." And for a long time, no one did. What lingered most wasn't violence or proof of foul play. It was absence. A family that should have come home from a weekend trip and didn't. 5 voices gone silent in a place that had never seemed dangerous until they disappeared. The trail remained open to hikers, but few went after that winter. Locals began referring to that stretch as the ridge that doesn't give back. Years later, old searchers would still remember the smell of wet pine and the uneasy feeling that followed them down from the mountain each night. They couldn't explain it, but many swore the woods grew quieter after sunset, as if the landscape itself was listening. Something about that place, the clean trailhead, the untouched car, the sudden stop, felt less like an accident and more like a secret the mountain had decided to keep. And that silence, that sense of something just beyond human reach, would hold for more than 3 decades before anyone would finally see what Laurel Ridge had hidden all along. The search for the Henderson family stretched into its second week, and the optimism that had once filled the Laurel Ridge trailhead was gone. What had started as a community rescue effort, neighbors, church groups, volunteer firefighters, had shifted into something heavier, quieter. The sheriff's department expanded their perimeter, mapping the ridge section by section. But the terrain seemed determined to fight them at every turn. The deeper they went into the mountains, the more it felt like the land itself didn't want to be searched. The Appalachian canopy above them was so thick that daylight never seemed to fully reach the forest floor. Helicopters circling overhead could barely see 10 feet through the trees. Even the drone of engines was muffled by the miles of pine and laurel below. It wasn't just darkness they were fighting. It was silence. Radio contact between ground teams failed without warning. Static distortion. Then nothing. Rangers began to log strange interference patterns, noting how compasses would drift off course near a section of the ridge locals called Devil's Basin. One of the deputies joked that compasses didn't just fail there. They spun like the mountain didn't know which way was north anymore. By the third week, the rescue effort had turned methodical. Dozens of searchers fanned out with grid maps, cadaver dogs, and metal detectors. They found nothing. Not a single campsite, not a fire pit, not even a torn candy wrapper. Experienced trackers said that was impossible. Even a lost family leaves a trail. Broken branches, shoe impressions, fragments of trash. But here, there was absolutely nothing. Every lead died in the same spot near the mouth of Devil's Basin. The basin itself wasn't easy to reach. It dropped suddenly into a narrow gorge carved deep into the hillside by centuries of rain runoff. Locals warned that there were places in that gorge where you could walk 20 feet and never hear your own echo. Sound didn't just fade, it stopped. One search volunteer later said it felt like being underwater. Everything around you too still, too heavy. The bloodhounds reacted the same way. They would follow a scent from the trailhead, whining and pulling toward the basin, and then, just as suddenly, stop cold, tails between their legs, refusing to go a step farther. It was during one of those sweeps that a park ranger named Bill Drummond noticed something hanging in a tree, 20 feet off the ground. At first he thought it was plastic, a piece of someone's gear caught by the wind. But when he climbed closer, he saw it was fabric, faded blue, torn along one edge. Later, photographs confirmed it matched the description of the jacket Dana Henderson was last seen wearing in a family photo from that weekend. The discovery brought temporary relief, finally something concrete. But it raised more questions than answers. The basin was nearly 6 miles from where the family's car was found. How could a mother of 3 make it that far through terrain this unforgiving, especially with small children in tow? And how did that fabric end up snagged so high above the ground in a place that required climbing gear to reach? Investigators combed the area for days after that. They found no footprints, no bones, no trace of a fall. The ridge was slick with mud from the storm, the ravine walls coated in moss and shale. It would have been near impossible to move through there without leaving some mark behind. Yet the forest floor looked untouched. A state trooper later said it was like searching inside a closed mouth. You could shout all you wanted, but the sound never came back. As weeks passed, rumors began filling the silence left by facts. Hunters from neighboring counties spoke about gunfire heard late that Saturday night, 3 sharp cracks echoing somewhere along the ridge. Others whispered about illegal poachers camping deep in the hollows, or moonshiners using the old mining tunnels that threaded beneath the mountain. One man swore he saw a faint orange glow rising from the trees the following morning, like a fire burning low and steady before vanishing completely. None of these accounts lined up with physical evidence, but they gave people something to cling to when logic offered nothing. The tunnels became a fixation for investigators. There were hundreds carved into the ridge from coal operations that shut down decades earlier. Some were sealed, others caved in or forgotten entirely. A few extended miles underground, unstable and uncharted. Searchers lowered cameras into the ones they could access, but all they found was cold air and black water. If the family had fallen into one, the odds of recovery were almost zero. "The mountain has holes," one deputy said. "It breathes, but it doesn't give back." By late November, the official search was scaled down. Snow began to gather on the higher elevations, coating the branches in white. Funding was running out, and so was hope. A state report filed that winter summarized the effort in a single line. Search terminated pending new evidence. Locals didn't like that phrasing. It sounded like the mountain had won. Even after the official crews left, a handful of volunteers kept returning on their own. Among them was Dana's sister, Lydia, who refused to accept that her family had simply vanished. She brought her own dogs, borrowed a metal detector, and hiked until her boots split open. Every time she ended up near the same place, Devil's Basin, standing at the edge, listening. It wasn't just quiet down there. It was wrong. Birds didn't call. Wind didn't move through the trees. She once said it felt like a vacuum of sound, a place that recorded nothing and returned nothing. Theories came and went over the next months. Some believed they'd wandered into an abandoned shaft. Others thought they'd run into someone who didn't want to be found. Hunters, drifters, someone dangerous. But without evidence, every theory eventually collapsed under its own weight. The last ranger's log entry from the search simply reads, "Area too steep for further recovery. Recommend closure until spring." When spring came, nobody went back. Laurel Ridge grew over itself again, the trails vanishing beneath a new layer of vines and fallen branches. The basin stayed untouched, too dangerous for casual hikers, too pointless for more search parties. The forest healed, at least on the surface, erasing what little had been disturbed. By the end of 1986, the Henderson disappearance became less a case and more a story, a warning told by locals about how easy it was to underestimate these mountains. People said the ridge swallowed sound, that even your own voice didn't belong to you up there. And as time passed, that phrase became its own explanation. Somewhere behind that silence, beyond the endless trees and broken shale, the truth was still there, buried, waiting, patient, but no one could see it. Not yet. And for the next 3 decades, the mountain would keep its secret. By the spring of 1986, the Henderson case had become what investigators quietly called a cold file. Officially, it was logged as an unresolved disappearance. Unofficially, it was something else. An ache that lingered in a small West Virginia county long after the last search party packed up and left. The flyers were still stapled to telephone poles that winter, but the rain had turned them soft, the ink bleeding down into unreadable streaks. People stopped asking questions. The sheriff's office had moved on to newer calls, domestic disputes, thefts, seasonal accidents. Laurel Ridge was closed off for safety until the snow melted. But even when it reopened, no one went near Devil's Basin. The place carried a kind of weight now, like a warning. Lydia Crowell couldn't let it go. She was Dana Henderson's younger sister, only 28, when her sister and family vanished. At first, she tried to accept the official explanation. They got lost, bad weather hit, and the mountain took them. But every time she replayed that thought, something didn't fit. Mark was careful, obsessive about details. Dana knew the woods better than most locals. They weren't the kind of people who simply wandered into the dark and disappeared. So, Lydia kept calling, kept showing up at the sheriff's desk with new theories, clippings, and maps. The deputies learned to brace themselves when she walked in. Polite, sympathetic, but tired of the same grief looping back every few months. By the early 90s, the case had faded from headlines completely, but Lydia refused to let it fade from memory. She drove up to Clay County every few months alone in an aging Buick that rattled on the gravel back roads. She'd tape new posters over the weathered ones, print their faces again with the words "Still Missing" in bold letters, even when she knew no one was looking anymore. Locals nodded kindly when she passed, some still offering coffee or directions, but others avoided her. To them, Lydia wasn't the grieving sister anymore. She was a ghost of her own, orbiting a story everyone else had long since buried. There were moments that almost reignited hope. In 1992, a hunter reported finding a children's shoe wedged in the rocks near a creek a few miles from Devil's Basin. Investigators collected it, compared it against the Henderson family's photos, but it wasn't a match. Another time, hikers claimed they heard faint voices calling through the hollows at dusk. 3 or 4 at once, distant, but clear enough to make them stop and listen. Searchers returned to the spot the next day, but found nothing. Each new lead sparked a few days of buzz, then silence. Through it all, Lydia kept a notebook, a kind of ledger documenting every call, every rumor, every supposed sighting, the pages filled with dead ends. There was one entry dated July 1987 that stood out. A park ranger had written in his report about faint tire impressions found off an old logging road roughly 5 miles south of the original trailhead. The road had been decommissioned in 1979 after a landslide cut off its access long before the Hendersons vanished. According to the ranger, The impressions looked fresh at the time, maybe less than a year old. He'd mentioned it casually during the investigation, but it never made it into the active search perimeter. No one followed up. That single overlooked detail would linger for decades, buried in paperwork, waiting for the right eyes to find it. As the years rolled on, the mountain's legend grew, fed by the silence of the case. Locals started calling Laurel Ridge the ridge that doesn't give back. Teenagers dared each other to hike it at night, testing their nerves against the dark. Hikers reported hearing echoes that didn't belong to their own voices, or seeing shapes moving along the tree line only to find nothing when they looked twice. Most dismissed it as superstition, a rural story built from fear and isolation. But for Lydia, every rumor was a thread she couldn't stop pulling. Her obsession came at a steep cost. Her marriage fell apart by 1998 after her husband told her he couldn't live with a ghost in the house. She sold her home 2 years later, using the money to hire private search teams and cadaver dogs. They found nothing. The forest refused to give up even a single piece of evidence. It was as if the Hendersons had been erased from existence entirely. By 2005, Lydia was living out of a small rental near Elk River, working part-time at a hardware store and spending her off days driving back up the ridge. Locals who saw her said she'd aged faster than her years, her hair streaked with grey, her skin pale from the mountain cold. Still, she hiked, carrying laminated maps and old ranger notes. One deputy years later would admit he avoided her because she made the silence worse. There was something about her presence up there that reminded people how easy it was to vanish and never be found. Meanwhile, the mountain reclaimed its quiet. Trees grew thicker along the old access road. The spot where the Hendersons' Bronco once sat at the trailhead was eventually repaved and reopened for campers. But the story never really left. Visitors who knew the tale still mentioned the family in low voices around campfires, describing the way the fog rolled in over Laurel Ridge like a tide, and how sound seemed to die just before the first bend toward Devil's Basin. The mountain, they said, had taken something and wasn't done keeping it. In the late 2000s, a small true crime blog picked up the Henderson disappearance as part of a Lost in Appalachia series. For a brief time, the case resurfaced. Comment sections filled with theories. Serial offenders, wildlife attacks, even government experiments buried beneath the old mines. None of it stuck. But one reader reached out directly to Lydia after reading the article. It was a retired forest surveyor who remembered the 1985 search. He mentioned something she'd never heard before. Old logging maps showed a narrow spur trail running from the original parking area toward the lower basin, an unmarked service route that disappeared from maps sometime in the late 70s. The name listed on the document was Service Road 19A, decommissioned in 1979. It was the same year the Rangers report had mentioned regarding the tire tracks. For Lydia, that detail reignited everything. She tried once more to convince authorities to reopen the case, but they declined. Too much time had passed, evidence had degraded, and budget constraints made a cold case search impossible. The county clerk's office told her, "We just don't have the resources to go digging through old roads." So she did it herself. For the next few years, she scoured public records, topographical maps, and satellite imagery. She traced what she believed was the path of that old road, one that seemed to vanish under a patch of dense forest just east of Devil's Basin. By then, the world had moved on to digital screens and fast news cycles. Missing person flyers became internet posts, and the Hendersons became just another unsolved case among thousands. But for Lydia, time hadn't moved at all. Each winter, she returned to the ridge alone, walking until the wind bit through her coat and her breath turned white. She'd stand at the overlook, staring down into the basin that had taken her sister's family, listening for anything. Even silence was something in its own way, a reminder that they were still there somewhere. 2 decades had passed since the family disappeared. 20 winters of snow piling over the same ground, melting and freezing again. 20 years of unanswered prayers and long drives back down the same winding road, headlights cutting through fog thick enough to feel. By 2007, Lydia's body was breaking down. Her knees failed her, and she could no longer hike the ridge. But she kept the maps on her kitchen table, the flyers stacked in a drawer, waiting for a day when someone, anyone, might look again. That day would come, but not from her. It would come 11 years later from a stranger holding a drone controller, flying over the same trees that had hidden her family for more than 3 decades. And what he saw through that camera would finally force the mountain to give back what it had kept all along. Every case we share isn't just a story. It's weeks of research, fact-checking, and rebuilding real lives that were lost. We do this because these stories matter, and someone out there still deserves to be remembered. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind these mysteries, please like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which part of today's case stayed with you. Watch more mysterious solved cold cases. Links are waiting for you in the description. Now, let's get back to the case. In the early months of 2018, Laurel Ridge had become a place most people drove past without even looking up. The trees that had once hidden one of West Virginia's strangest disappearances were just part of the scenery now, another stretch of the Appalachian backcountry that only existed in local folklore. But what time had erased from conversation, technology was about to uncover by accident. 35-year-old Evan Mercer wasn't a detective or a historian. He was a freelance surveyor, the kind of guy who spent weekends flying drones over rural property lines, logging soil shifts, erosion paths, and creek bed changes for private contracts. That winter, a company out of Charleston hired him to map flood-prone forest areas south of Clay County. He had no idea that his equipment would end up hovering above the exact same stretch of wilderness where the Henderson family vanished 33 years earlier. Evan flew his drone in wide, sweeping passes that afternoon, the machine humming quietly over Devil's Basin as sunlight threaded between the trees. The footage streamed back to his laptop looked like any other Appalachian hillside, rolling terrain, broken canopy, dark green shadows. But near the end of his flight, as the drone banked to return to base, the camera caught something fleeting, a flash of reflected light deep under the treetops where no sunlight should have reached. At first, he dismissed it, probably wet rock or an old piece of mining scrap half buried in the soil. But later that night, reviewing the data frame by frame, he paused. The reflection wasn't random. It came from a distinct curved surface, smooth, metallic, and unmistakably man-made. Evan zoomed in, freezing the image mid-blur. Under the layers of branches and moss, there was a pattern. Chipped green paint, faded white lettering. It looked like a car roof. The coordinates placed the object roughly 6 miles from the original Henderson search zone, on the opposite side of Devil's Basin, in terrain so steep that even rescue teams had once ruled it non-traversable. Evan clipped a still frame and posted it to a local drone hobbyist forum, asking if anyone recognized the shape. The post sat unnoticed for 2 days before someone finally commented. It was a retired deputy named Frank Alden, the man who had worked the original disappearance back in 1985. Frank sent a private message that same night. Where exactly was this taken? By morning, Evan's inbox was full. The Clay County Sheriff's Office wanted the coordinates, the Forestry Division wanted the footage, and within 48 hours, the once-forgotten ridge was swarming again with life. County trucks parked along the old trailhead, news crews set up tripods, and state investigators prepared to hike toward the coordinates that had haunted the area for decades. The search team that went in wasn't large, just 6 men, but they were the best the state had to offer. All of them were seasoned rangers, men who had spent their careers navigating steep elevation and poor visibility. They came prepared for a fight with the landscape, carrying satellite radios, military-grade GPS trackers, and machetes to hack through 30 years of unchecked underbrush. It took nearly half a day just to reach the first coordinate marker Evan Mercer had flagged. The terrain inside Devil's Basin was actually worse than the drone footage had suggested. It was a chaotic mix of collapsed gullies, slick clay walls that crumbled under boots, and fallen pines stacked like barricades against the living. But near sunset, as the light began to fail, one of the rangers called out. He had spotted something unnatural protruding from the earth. At first glance, it was only a few square inches of corroded surface, barely distinguishable from the wet stone around it. But as the team moved in and began clearing the debris, the outline became undeniable. It was a rectangular roof crushed inward by immense pressure, its once bright paint dulled to a muted greenish brown that matched the forest floor. The team worked in absolute silence, their gloves scraping against rust and dirt until the shape of a full vehicle emerged. It was a Ford Bronco, overturned, wedged tightly between two ancient oaks and half swallowed by the hillside. The sheriff at the time, Tom Reeves, was on site by dusk. He stood by as a ranger wiped a layer of grime from the rear license plate. When the flashlight beam hit the stamped metal, revealing the alphanumeric code, the entire team fell silent. The numbers were faint, pitted by corrosion, but they were legible. They matched, character for character, the vehicle registered to Mark Henderson. It was the same license plate, the same make, the same model as the Bronco that, according to every official report, had been found parked neatly at the Laurel Ridge trailhead in 1985. At first, Reeves refused to believe it. His immediate thought was that there had to be an error. Maybe someone had swapped plates years ago as a prank. Or perhaps it was a stolen car dumped here later to confuse the case. But a quick field cross-check with the national database silenced those theories. The VIN prefix, etched into the chassis and verified against the registration history, confirmed it. The Bronco buried under the trees was, without a doubt, the Henderson family's vehicle. The confirmation sent a chill through the investigation that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air. If this was their car, the car they had driven out of their driveway in October 1985, then what exactly had been sitting at the trailhead all those years ago? What vehicle had the Rangers searched? Whose keys were in the ignition? Whose sandwiches were in the cooler? The discovery didn't just solve a mystery, it broke reality. News of the discovery spread with viral speed. By the next morning, word had reached Charleston, and before the week was over. National outlets were running headlines that reignited interest across the country. Drone pilot finds missing family, and the mystery of the second Bronco. Theories exploded overnight on forums and social media. Some armchair detectives argued it was proof of a massive cover-up, suggesting the original car had been switched or staged to hide a crime. Others argued for coincidence, the same model, the same color, a case of mistaken identity by overworked deputies in 1985. But deep down, most people knew coincidences of that magnitude didn't happen. Not twice, not in the same county, and not involving a family that had vanished without a trace. Investigators cordoned off the basin and began a forensic excavation that would rival an archaeological dig. The earth packed around the vehicle was dense, layered with decades of rot, root growth, and shifting soil. Removing the Bronco without collapsing the hillside required delicate, agonizingly slow work. It took days. As the dirt was peeled back layer by layer, small fragments of a life interrupted started surfacing, shattered safety glass, bits of synthetic fabric that hadn't decayed, a child's shoe sole, warped by time but still recognizable. It was clear that whatever story the mountain had buried was about to surface, piece by piece. For those who remembered the original search in 1985, the reawakening of the case was deeply unsettling. Sheriff Reeves described the scene in an interview later that year with a haunted look in his eyes. "It wasn't just finding a car," he said. "It was like touching something that had been asleep too long. You could feel the years in that hole." The searchers moved carefully, almost reverently. They knew what was coming. They knew that a car didn't end up buried this deep in the woods, seatbelts fastened, without passengers. Late on the fourth day, the excavation crew cleared enough of the driver's side window to see inside. The interior was crushed inward, filled with compacted soil and fragments of leaves that had seeped in through the cracks. But beneath that debris, the beam of their lights caught the undeniable shape of skeletal remains. There were 5 in total, positioned exactly as if they were still driving. They had never left their seats. The discovery broke through every wall of disbelief the town had built over 3 decades. DNA testing would take weeks to be official, but everyone on that mountain already knew. The Henderson family had finally been found. Still, the impossible question lingered, casting a shadow over the recovery. How could their real vehicle end up here, 6 miles away in a ravine, when another Bronco matching theirs in every visible detail had been recovered and processed 33 years earlier? Investigators immediately ordered the reopening of the 1985 evidence files. They went hunting for the original vehicle, the one that had sat in the impound lot, the one that had been the center of the first investigation. They found nothing. The original vehicle, the imposter Bronco, had vanished. The storage facility records painted a picture of bureaucratic chaos. The paperwork showed a transfer request for storage relocation in 1994, part of a county-wide evidence consolidation project. A single, illegible signature authorized the move, but the receiving department claimed they never took possession of it. There was no subsequent log entry, no paper trail, no scrapyard receipt. Somewhere in the lost years between 1985 and the present, the physical evidence that might have explained the anomaly had quietly disappeared. Even the photos were gone. Early evidence archives had been digitized poorly in the late 90s, and the original negatives had degraded into vinegar and blur. What remained was only a written record, a ghost in the paperwork describing a car that shouldn't have existed. When reporters pressed the sheriff's office for comment on the missing vehicle, the response was short and defensive. "We are reviewing archival material to determine the chain of custody." Privately, however, deputies admitted the truth to one another. They might never know how or why there were two identical vehicles. The rediscovery divided the community. Some called it divine justice, that the truth had outlasted the incompetence. Others called it corruption, believing the lost car was a convenient way to bury a mistake. But for the Henderson relatives, especially Lydia Crowell, who was now nearing 70, the conspiracy theories didn't matter. The strange details about license plates and impound lots were noise. What mattered was that the mountain had finally given something back. For the first time in 3 decades, she had a physical place to direct her grief. In the days that followed, the basin filled with a grim parade of investigators, journalists, and curious locals who stood behind yellow police tape, staring down into the dark hollow that had swallowed a family whole. The old myths came alive again. Whispers of cursed ground, of sounds that vanished in the air, of a forest that chose when to reveal its secrets. But even as the remains were carefully lifted and labeled, even as forensic teams began piecing together the physics of the crash, one question stayed unresolved. If this was where they had truly ended up, then who had placed their car, their keys, and their belongings so neatly back at the trailhead all those years ago? No one could answer that yet. As the final pieces of the Bronco were hoisted out of Devil's Basin, the investigators realized this was no longer just a missing persons case. It was something stranger. It was a story that had defied logic for 33 years, and a mystery that was about to deepen even more once the forensic results came in from the lab. The excavation at Devil's Basin lasted 6 grueling days. Crews rotated in 12-hour shifts, working from sunrise to absolute dark under heavy halogen floodlights that painted the forest in a ghostly, artificial yellow. Every shovelful of soil was sifted, catalogued, and bagged. The overturned Bronco was effectively fused to the hillside. Its metal skeleton had been welded to roots, rock, and 33 years of earth. When investigators finally broke through the driver's side window to access the cabin, the chatter on the radio stopped. Inside, beneath layers of packed clay and leaf rot, were the bones. 5 distinct skeletons, still in place, still secured by the nylon webbing of their seatbelts. The scene was both clinical and deeply human. Forensic anthropologists moved slowly, brushing away sediment as if waking someone from a long sleep. They labeled everything: femurs, ribs, jaw fragments, and recorded the precise coordinates where each was found. There was no mistaking the configuration: 2 adult bodies in the front seats, 3 smaller ones in the back. The Hendersons had been there the entire time, entombed by the forest that had swallowed them. The discovery hit Clay County like a shockwave. News outlets returned to a town that had tried for decades to forget, filling the local hotels and diners. People gathered outside the courthouse, reading updates posted to a corkboard hour by hour, just as they had done in 1985. Lydia Crowell was escorted to the recovery site 2 days later. She stood at the edge of the cordon, holding onto a ranger's arm for balance as the crews lifted out each evidence bag. When one of the forensic officers approached her to confirm that DNA analysis was officially underway, she didn't speak. She just nodded once, staring at the empty hole in the ground, looking like she had always known they were there. 3 weeks later, the lab results came back, confirming what everyone already knew. The remains belonged to Mark and Dana Henderson and their 3 children. After 33 years of speculation, the question of whether they were dead was finally answered. But the how and the why, specifically why there were 2 identical Broncos connected to the same family, remained an open wound. The Clay County Sheriff's Office reopened the file, desperate to make sense of the duality. Investigators started by verifying the vehicle data again, tracing the VIN from state registration archives. The number etched into the rusted chassis in the ravine matched the Hendersons' official record perfectly. Yet according to the dusty paperwork from 1985, that exact vehicle had already been recovered, processed, and stored in the county evidence lot following the original disappearance. When detectives went searching for the paper trail of the impounded Bronco, they hit a wall of incompetence. The storage facility records showed a confusing, contradictory path. In 1994, the vehicle had been listed for transfer to an off-site impound during a consolidation project. Inzingel's signature authorized the move, but the receiving department claimed they never received it. There was no intake form, no scrap record, no sale receipt. Somewhere in the bureaucracy of small-town record-keeping, the original Bronco, the one that shouldn't have existed if the family was in the ravine, had vanished into thin air. No photos survived either. The early evidence archives had been digitized poorly, and the original negatives had long since degraded. What remained was only a written record, a ghost in the paperwork, leaving investigators with a physical wreck in the woods and a phantom car in the files. The more investigators pulled at the thread of the phantom Bronco, the clearer it became that this case had suffered from human error layered over human tragedy. The prevailing theory was that the vehicle found at the trailhead in 1985 had simply been misidentified, a similar make and model, perhaps belonging to a hiker who forgot to lock their doors, which was then swapped or misfiled in the chaos of a frantic search. It wasn't a cover-up. It was incompetence that had hardened into a mystery over time. Still, even that explanation didn't fully sit right. Some locals persisted in the belief that the car at the trailhead had been staged to throw off search teams, though no one could ever explain who would do such a thing or why. The true breakthrough came when state geologists were brought in to assess the stability of the terrain where the Henderson vehicle was found. They uncovered something that shifted the focus entirely. Old topographic maps from the Department of Natural Resources showed a service track, a narrow dirt road once used by rangers and logging crews that ran from the Laurel Ridge trailhead down toward the lower basin. The road had been decommissioned in 1979 after a series of landslides made it unsafe. In most official records, it no longer existed. By 1985, it had been overgrown and erased from the latest park pamphlets, but one surviving copy of an older brochure, found preserved inside the Bronco's glove compartment, still listed that service road as active. Forensic reconstruction of the crash began in early May, and the picture it painted was terrifyingly simple. Surveyors mapped the slope and determined that during the late afternoon of October 12, 1985, the region had experienced a sudden, heavy fog event. A whiteout, dense enough to obscure visibility beyond 10 feet. Investigators theorized that the Hendersons, using the outdated map, had taken the decommissioned road, believing it was a shortcut or a loop that would reconnect to the main trail. In the low light and thick fog, Mark likely followed the path until it simply ended. The road gave way to a steep drop that hadn't been visible from behind the wheel. The impact marks on the crushed hood supported this trajectory. The Bronco appeared to have nosedived into the slope, flipped once, and landed upside down, wedged tightly between 2 large oak trees. The impact would have been catastrophic, instantly sealing the vehicle from view beneath the canopy. The following rainstorms that weekend accelerated a minor landslide, washing soft clay and debris over the wreck. Within months, moss, vines, and runoff had completely hidden it. From above, the ground looked undisturbed. Forensic teams pieced together more fragments of the Hendersons' final hours, and the details were heartbreaking. The seatbelt mechanism suggested that most of the family was alive when the vehicle came to rest. The positions of the bodies indicated minimal movement afterward, a likely sign of severe injuries or shock. A few personal items survived the decades of decay. A rusted wristwatch stopped at 8:42, a set of keys still attached to a keychain shaped like a trout, a melted flashlight found between the front seats. They must have tried to see, to signal, or just find comfort in that small pool of light. Most poignant of all was a waterlogged map folded neatly in the glove box. The paper had disintegrated, but the ink had bled into the fibers, preserving one detail: a red circle drawn by Mark around the ridge overlook. It was the same circle investigators had noted in 1985 when a copy of that map was found on the dashboard of the wrong Bronco at the trailhead. That detail haunted the new investigators. How had an identical map, marked in the exact same way, ended up in both cars? The likeliest answer was paperwork confusion, that photos of the wrong vehicle had been labeled as the Hendersons. But to the people who'd spent decades living under the shadow of this story, it felt more like the mountain had been playing tricks all along, rearranging evidence until no one could tell what belonged to whom. When the final report was released, the official conclusion was heartbreakingly ordinary. The Henderson family had driven onto a long-forgotten road, blinded by fog, and accidentally plunged into a ravine that concealed them for 33 years. No foul play, no conspiracy, just a chain of small, tragic errors. An outdated map, a missed search radius, and time itself closing over them. Still, the discovery didn't erase the unease. Investigators noted how close the site was to Devil's Basin, and how the magnetic anomalies in that specific area had caused compasses and radios to fail back in 1985. Some wondered aloud how search teams could have missed the vehicle if they'd passed within half a mile of it. "You could be standing right above it and never know," one ranger said. "The forest here swallows light." In June 2018, when the remains were finally released to the family, the town held a small memorial service. The 5 caskets were lying side by side beneath a white canopy, each draped in flowers collected from the ridge. Reporters stood quietly at the back while Lydia Crowell, now 71, sat alone in the front row. For decades, she had begged the world to look again. Now that it had, there was no comfort, only finality. But the story didn't end there. When forensic analysts finished cleaning the interior of the Bronco, they found one final object wedged beneath the driver's seat. It was a piece of plastic casing from an old handheld radio, its frequency dial frozen between 2 numbers. This radio shouldn't have been in the family car. The make and model were specific, issued only to park personnel and logging foremen in the late 1970s. The serial number was too eroded to trace, but the find raised one last, unanswerable question. Had the Hendersons encountered someone on that forgotten road before the crash? Or had they found the radio somewhere along the way, picking it up unaware of what it meant? The report didn't speculate, it simply listed the item as inconclusive. By the time the last bag of evidence was sealed and the hillside receded, the earth had closed over the basin again. The forest would regrow just as it always had, hiding its scars beneath the same quiet canopy. But the unease lingered, the sense that the mountain had decided when the truth would surface, and only then allowed it to be seen. As investigators packed up, preparing to leave the site for the final time, one of them looked back toward the ridge and said something that stuck in every news story written afterward. "After all these years, we didn't find them. The mountain let them be found." When investigators finally pieced together what had happened, it was not the story anyone had imagined for over 3 decades. There was no foul play, no sinister stranger lurking in the woods, no cover-up. Just a string of quiet, ordinary missteps that had turned fatal in the most remote place imaginable. The official reconstruction of the timeline is a testament to how quickly safety can evaporate. Experts estimated the Bronco went over the edge sometime between 6 and 7 p.m., just as the light was bleeding out of the sky. The descent was nearly vertical for the first 100 feet before leveling into a steep roll. The car hit the first oak at full speed, flipped once, and landed upside down in a pocket of soft soil and roots. When the engine finally stopped ticking, the mountain closed in. The Appalachian night is a kind of silence that feels alive. The temperature can drop 40 degrees after sundown. Investigators believe the Bronco's cabin stayed sealed long enough to trap some heat, but without food, water, or movement, it wouldn't have lasted. A few fragments of packaging told them the family had tried to ration what little they had. The corner of a sandwich bag, the crumbled foil of a chocolate bar. The smallest bones, belonging to the youngest child, showed no sign of trauma at all, only stillness. Moisture had destroyed most organic traces, but deep in the footwell of the passenger seat, technicians recovered the ghost of something human. A small sheet of paper pressed into the mud, its ink long washed away. It might have been a note, or just a page torn from a map. Either way, they handled it as if it were sacred. Everyone on site agreed that someone, probably Dana, had tried to write something before the end. The official report would later describe it clinically. Vehicle came to rest inverted. Evidence suggests occupants survived initial impact. No attempt at self-rescue due to terrain and visibility. Probable exposure fatality within 24 to 36 hours. But that sterile summary didn't come close to what investigators felt standing there. They could almost picture it. The Bronco wedged in the hollow, fog pressing down from above, the woods absolutely still. No wind, no voices, no sound at all. Just the ticking of cooling metal and 5 people waiting for daylight that never really came. When daylight did arrive, it was 33 years too late. By November 2018, the case that had haunted Clay County for half a lifetime finally came to a close. The Hendersons were laid to rest together at a cemetery in Charleston. Their caskets, small and uniform, were carried by deputies who hadn't even been born when the search first began. The service was quiet. No cameras, no reporters inside. Just family, a few surviving friends, and the same handful of rangers who had spent their youth combing the ridge for any trace of them. Lydia Crowell sat near the front, her hands trembling as she gripped a folded copy of the original missing persons flyer. The paper was yellowed, the ink almost gone, but she still carried it everywhere. After the ceremony, she stayed behind when everyone else left. In the weeks that followed, journalists wrote about the Henderson case as a story of closure. They used words like resolution and peace. But for those who had searched the ridge, the truth didn't feel peaceful. It felt merciless. They had spent thousands of hours combing a radius less than 2 miles from where the family had actually been. They had stood above them, unaware, separated only by dirt and trees and the quiet indifference of nature. When state investigators finalized their findings, the report ended with a line that caught everyone's attention. Discovery achieved through drone imagery, not active search. That detail stuck with people. For decades, human eyes, human effort, and human hope had failed. In the end, it was a camera flown by a stranger that finally saw through the canopy. A machine had found what the living could not. It wasn't lost on anyone that the very technology that solved the mystery hadn't even existed when the family vanished. Back then, they had relied on printed maps, fading trail signs, and weather forecasts that couldn't predict the kind of mountain fog that changes everything in seconds. In 1985, they had driven into the unknown with full trust that the road ahead existed simply because a piece of paper told them it did. When the case file finally closed in early 2019, the sheriff added a note in his own handwriting on the last page. Sometimes the mountain wins. He wasn't being poetic. He was acknowledging what everyone in Appalachia already knew, that the landscape keeps its secrets until it's ready to give them back. Today, if you hike near Laurel Ridge, the new trail markers avoid the old service road entirely. The forest has reclaimed the area, thick with saplings and undergrowth. Somewhere beneath that soil lies the shallow impression where the Bronco rested for all those years, now filled with ferns and rainwater. There's no plaque, no memorial, just quiet. And maybe that's fitting. Because in the end, the story of the Henderson family isn't about mystery or malice. It's about how small we are against the places that made us, how a single wrong turn can echo for decades, and how sometimes, even in an age of satellites and sensors, it still takes the Earth itself deciding to release what it's been holding before the truth is ever seen. As the investigation faded from headlines, people moved on again. The ridge returned to its stillness, but every now and then, On clear mornings when the fog hangs low over Devil's Basin, a glint of light flashes between the trees, the reflection of metal deep below, caught by the sun for only a second before vanishing again. It's not from the Bronco. That was long removed. But the locals say the forest keeps the memory of what it takes, and maybe that's true. Because some places don't just bury their secrets. They keep them until the right eyes, at the right moment, finally look down and see what was there all along. There are thousands of stories, like the Hendersons hiding in the American wilderness. Mysteries swallowed by geography and time, if you believe, like we do, that every one of them deserves to be found. Please hit that like button and subscribe to Signal 49. It helps us dig deeper into the archives to bring these cases into the light. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think the radio found under the seat was just a piece of debris, or did the family encounter someone on that old service road before the end? Let us know your theory. Until next time, stay safe and keep watching the tree line.